Welcome, dear listeners, to yet another captivating mystery. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you're the first to know when an audiobook releases. And now, for the feature presentation, Murder at Eldridge Hall. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Eldridge. The letter from Lady Agatha Marwood arrived on a grey Tuesday morning, its heavy cream envelope bearing the distinctive seal of Eldridge Hall. A winged lion embossed in gold, with a faint smear of wax as though hurriedly pressed. It was addressed in a precise, elegant hand. To Inspector Harold Price, Scotland Yard, London. Inspector Price was just finishing his second cup of tea and reviewing a case of petty embezzlement when the post was delivered to his desk. He eyed the envelope with mild curiosity, and then slit it open with his letter opener and unfolded the parchment. It read, "Inspector Price, forgive the suddenness of this note, but I believe something dreadful may happen at my annual masquerade ball this Saturday at Eldridge Hall. I do not wish to cause alarm, nor do I desire publicity. However, I feel it would be wise to have someone of your calibre in attendance. Quietly, of course. Should nothing come of it, I shall owe you a debt of gratitude and a fine bottle of Marlow sherry. Should my fears prove correct, well then, I suspect we shall both have work to do. Lady Agatha Marwood." Price read the letter twice, no details, no mention of a specific threat, just a premonition, cloaked in the sort of vague social grace that the upper classes had perfected over generations. He had met Lady Agatha once, years ago, during a diplomatic scandal involving her late husband, Sir Cedric Marwood, and certain questionable financial ties in Belgium. She had struck him then as intelligent, tightly wound, and disarmingly cold. Now evidently she was nervous. He made a brief inquiry with his superior and was given leave to travel. "Take a holiday, Price," his chief had said with a sardonic smile, "though I suppose only you would consider a murder at a masquerade as leisure." Eldridge Hall was a sprawling manor in the Somerset countryside, built in the late 1700s and restored after the Great War. It was known for its collection of Dutch masters, its opulent ballroom, and its mistress's fierce privacy. Price arrived by motor car late Friday afternoon. A long drive led to the main house, framed by yew hedges and ancient oaks. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and roses in a half-bloom. A butler, tall, narrow, and expressionless, opened the door before Price could knock. "Inspector Price, I presume. Her ladyship is expecting you." He was led through marbled corridors lit by soft amber sconces. Everything gleamed with wealth that had grown old and careful, polished but not showy. The walls bore portraits of dead Marwoods, with stern eyes and powdered wigs. Lady Agatha awaited him in the green drawing-room, seated on a high-backed velvet chair, like a woman presiding over her own inquest. "Inspector," she said, rising only slightly, "how good of you to come." She was in her early 60s, her figure spare and upright, her hair pinned in a crown of silver. Her dress was bottle green, and she wore no jewellery save a signet ring and a pearl comb. "I must confess," Price began, "your letter intrigued me. But it lacked any specific allegation. What exactly do you fear will happen?" She studied him for a moment before pouring tea into 2 china cups. "I fear," she said slowly, "that someone attending tomorrow's masquerade intends to kill." Price's brow furrowed. "And you know this how?" "I received a note, anonymous, typed and curious. It said only, 'The masks will not hide what must be paid.' It arrived the day after I finalised the guest list." She handed him the note. It was on cheap paper, the type smudged as though from an old machine. "You think this is a threat?" "I do," she said. "You see, Inspector, Eldridge Hall has, over the years, collected people with overlapping secrets. There are debts, grudges, old wounds reopened by new scandals." Price sipped the tea, which was unusually strong. "Tell me, Lady Agatha, who exactly have you invited to this little masquerade?" She unfolded a delicate card from a drawer. The guest list was scrawled in fine ink. Hugo Danforth, retired colonel, war hero. Vivian Street Clare, actress of the London stage. Peter Radley, up-and-coming novelist. Colonel Reginald Barrington, military attaché. Eliza Marwood, Lady Agatha's estranged niece. Dr. Julian Bexley, society physician. Margot Fontaine, opera singer of European renown. And several others of lesser note, aristocrats, old family friends, and a few curious additions from the world of art and letters. Price recognised at least 3 names from his files, not criminals per se, but certainly entangled in curious matters, scandals, inquiries, quiet settlements. Lady Agatha placed her teacup down carefully. I do not ask you to intervene unless there is cause. I only ask that you attend, unannounced, as a guest, observe, listen, and should the worst happen, Price nodded, then I'll already be here. It was the eve of the ball, and that evening the house began to fill. Cars arrived in a slow procession, headlights piercing the dusk. Footmen in silver-trimmed uniforms carried trunks and masks. Music drifted from the rehearsal in the ballroom, violins tuning, harps gliding through rehearsed chords. Inspector Price dressed for dinner, his invitation naming him as Mr. Charles Grey of Kensington. His cover was arranged. His eyes, however, remained those of Scotland Yard, sharp, steady, and unconvinced. He dined quietly, observing his fellow guests. The colonel's jaw clenched each time Lady Agatha spoke. The actress drank too quickly and laughed too loudly. The young writer was watching everyone. And the niece, Eliza, wore a crimson pendant and a gaze too calm for someone so recently disinherited. No one knew who the masked man among them really was. And the clock ticked down to midnight. The masquerade would begin tomorrow, and with it, perhaps, a reckoning. Chapter 2. Masks and Misdirection. Saturday, October 22nd, 1927. Eldridge Hall, Somerset. The morning light came dappled through the mullioned windows of Eldridge Hall, spilling across the polished wooden floors and age-worn tapestries. Inspector Harold Price stood at his window, adjusting the cuffs of his formal shirt. The masquerade ball was hours away, and the household was bustling with quiet preparations. Chandeliers cleaned, platters arranged, glasses polished, carpets brushed to velvet smoothness. The arrival of guests. By late afternoon, the guests had begun emerging from their rooms like characters summoned onto a stage. The costumes, delivered by a famed costumier from Covent Garden, ranged from the sublime to the absurd. Vivian Street Clare, ever the dramatist, chose a slinky Venetian gown of midnight blue satin and a lace mask adorned with black feathers. She descended the staircase like a duchess from an opera, her every gesture exaggerated for effect. Colonel Hugo Danforth came as a Roman senator, his military posture barely concealed beneath the drape of a crimson toga. His grey temples and hard-set jaw made him look carved from stone. Peter Radley, the young writer, was dressed as the French poet Baudelaire, complete with a wilted lily in his lapel and an ironic smirk. Eliza Marwood, Lady Agatha's niece, wore a Grecian gown of silver silk and a mask so delicate it looked like frost caught on spiderwebs. She smiled little, her eyes observing rather than engaging. Lady Agatha herself appeared just before sunset. She was dressed as a medieval queen in green velvet, her silver hair braided in a coronet, and her mask of mother of pearl obscured her face almost entirely. As for Price, he wore a simple black and white domino mask and a dark tailcoat. By 8 o'clock, the ballroom had transformed. Crimson drapes had been drawn shut. Dozens of wax tapers flickered from iron sconces and candelabras. A quartet played a haunting waltz beneath the gilded ceiling. The dance floor gleamed. Couples twirled in half-step. Laughter echoed across the parquet, and beneath the masks, everyone's true self seemed either hidden or heightened. Price moved through the crowd in silence, listening more than speaking. He observed subtle tensions, a clenched jaw here, a sudden stiffening of posture there. At one point, he caught Hugo Danforth in a heated exchange with Colonel Barrington near the drinks table. Their voices hushed but faces taut. "Still carrying grudges, are we, Barrington?" Danforth muttered. "Only against those who've earned them," came the growled reply. Nearby, Vivienne flitted from man to man, her laughter too sharp to be genuine, and Peter Radley stood alone, brooding in a corner, eyes darting from Eliza to Hugo and back again. At precisely 10 past 10, just as the quartet struck up a brisk mazurka, the lights flickered. Only for a moment, but long enough for murmurs to ripple through the crowd. Then the lights came back. Lady Agatha, seated near the musicians, clapped her hands to resume the dance. But Price noticed something strange. Vivienne's mask was askew, and her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a glass of champagne. Hugo Danforth was no longer on the dance floor, nor was Eliza. A minute later, the scream came, from the music room adjacent to the ballroom. A footman burst in, pale and breathless. "My lady, forgive me, but Colonel Danforth—" Price was already moving. The music room was still. A mahogany pianoforte stood in the corner, flanked by red velvet curtains, and there, just behind the drawn drapes, lay Hugo Danforth, his body collapsed in an awkward, seated position against the wall. One hand clutched the curtain, the other rested across his chest. He was unmistakably dead. Inspector Price knelt and took in the details with practiced calm. There was no sign of violence, no wound, no bruising, no struggle, but the man's eyes were wide open in what appeared to be shock, his lips slightly parted. On the table nearby was a crystal tumbler, half full, with a faint purple tinge staining the rim. Price lifted the glass and sniffed. Then he dipped a finger and touched it to his tongue. Foxglove, a potent cardiac poison, digitalis, bitter, almost undetectable in wine, unless one knew to look. Lady Agatha arrived moments later, her mask removed and her face pale. "Dear God," she whispered, staring at Hugo's body. "I feared something would happen, but not this." Price stood slowly. "Lady Agatha, I need the guests confined to the ballroom. No one leaves, no one enters. This is now a crime scene." She nodded. "Do you believe," she asked quietly, "that he was the intended victim?" Price looked again at the half-empty glass. The lipstick mark on the rim was not Hugo's. And the poison, too subtle, too slow for dramatic effect. It had been meant to go unnoticed. "No," he said, "I believe he drank from someone else's glass." As the guests were gathered and the ballroom doors sealed, Price took a long breath and looked around at the sea of masked faces. Somewhere among them was a murderer. Chapter 3. Faces Behind the Masks. The masquerade had ended, not with a final dance or a farewell toast, but with a sudden silence. As the grand ballroom was locked and the guests informed of Colonel Hugo Danforth's death, unease seeped into the gathering. No one had removed their masks just yet. Inspector Harold Price returned to the ballroom. His mask now hung loosely from his coat pocket, exposing his keen grey eyes and the measured set of his jaw. He turned to face the guests, who stood in uneasy clusters, champagne forgotten in trembling hands, fans fluttering, cravats loosened. "Ladies and gentlemen," Price began, his voice calm but firm, "you are all now part of a police inquiry. No one is under arrest, but until further notice, no one is to leave Eldridge Hall." A few gasps, a rustle of silk, then silence again. "I will speak to each of you in turn. Kindly remain composed and be truthful. The sooner I understand what happened tonight, the sooner this unpleasantness will be resolved." Lady Agatha nodded solemnly in support. The guests did not protest, but beneath the lace and feathers and painted smiles, Price could sense it. Tension, unspoken truths and fear. Dr. Julian Bexley, a society physician in a punchinello mask, had been the first to inspect the body after Price. Now, in a small sitting room beside the music hall, the two men spoke in low tones. "No signs of trauma," Bexley confirmed. "Heart failure by the look of it, but not natural. The discoloration on the lips, the slight tremor in the fingertips. I'd wager poison," fast acting. Foxglove? Price asked. Bexley nodded. Digitalis, quite possibly, but we'll need proper analysis to be sure. It's used in medicine, but in high doses. He trailed off, shrugging. Lethal. Price jotted down the facts in his notebook. And the glass? It had lipstick, dark red. Yes, Bexley said, which meant only one thing. Colonel Hugo Danforth drank from someone else's glass, whether by accident or design. Suspect 1, Vivienne Street, Clare. Vivienne Street. Clare was seated alone on a velvet chaise in Lady Agatha's drawing room, her mask now removed. Without the feathers and shadow, her face revealed the signs of age artfully concealed by powder and clever lighting, but her dark eyes were sharp. She lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. You and Colonel Danforth had a history, Price began. I understand you were once close? Vivienne exhaled a plume of smoke. You might say that. Once, a decade ago. Before the war, before everything changed. Why was he here tonight? She shrugged. Ask Lady Agatha. She invites whomever she pleases. I hadn't seen Hugo in years, but I was surprised. Price noted the hesitation. Surprised? He sent me a letter 3 weeks ago. Said he had something to tell me. Something life-changing. It was cryptic. Typical Hugo. What did you think he meant? I thought it was another game. A power play. He liked keeping people guessing. Price folded his arms. Did you share a drink with him tonight? She frowned. I had a glass of champagne, yes, but I don't remember where I put it. The footman refilled it at some point. There were so many glasses, so many hands. Her voice was suddenly quiet. Did you argue with him? Vivienne turned to the window, her voice now tinged with sorrow. Not aloud. Suspect 2. Colonel Barrington. Reginald Barrington, older, gruffer, and more angular than Hugo, stood rigidly in one of the hall's antechambers, mask tucked under his arm. You and Danforth served together in India, Price said. We did. You disliked him. I respected him, Barrington said curtly. But no, I didn't like him. Why not? He was reckless, arrogant. He used people, men under his command, and women beyond it. Price's pen didn't pause. Did you see him during the masquerade? Barrington hesitated. Yes, we spoke, briefly. About? Old times? And did you notice anything unusual? Barrington's jaw clenched. He was more nervous than I remembered. Kept glancing at his watch, as if waiting for something. Or someone, Price thought. Suspect 3. Peter Radley. Peter Radley looked the part of a tragic poet, dishevelled dark hair, a black frock coat, and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that seemed too small for his long, pale face. You knew Hugo Danforth? No, but I knew of him. He served with your brother, I understand. Yes, Radley said softly. Before my brother died in Flanders. Did Danforth have anything to do with that? Peter's eyes gleamed. He was his commanding officer. My brother wrote about him in his letters, spoke of recklessness, of disregard for human life. He blamed him. Price nodded slowly. And you came here tonight for what? Closure. Radley met his eyes. I came for the story. Everything I write is based on truth, or something very close to it. And did you see him drink? No, but I saw him argue with Lady Agatha just after the lights flickered. That caught Price's attention. Suspect 4. Eliza Marwood. Lady Agatha's niece sat composedly, her silver Grecian gown draped across a fainting chair. She had removed her mask, revealing a fine-boned face and eyes that looked older than her years. You were seen leaving the ballroom just before the lights flickered, Price said. I needed air, Eliza replied calmly. I went to the library. Convenient. You can check with the maid. She passed me on the stairs. Price made a note. You disliked Hugo? I didn't know him well enough to dislike him, but he was persistent. In what sense? He believed Lady Agatha's fortune should go to me, not to charity. That surprised Price. Did he say why? He claimed to have evidence about her past, about Sir Cedric. Something involving Africa, I believe. I didn't listen. I thought he was trying to manipulate me. And did you drink anything tonight? A glass of Burgundy, from the tray. Did you leave it unattended? Eliza gave a bitter smile. Inspector, at a masquerade, nothing is attended. That night, as Price sat with Lady Agatha by the fire, he turned the facts over in his mind. This was no crime of passion, he said. It was cold, calculated, the poison was measured precisely, and the target may not have been Hugo at all. Lady Agatha stared into the flames. Then who? Price took a long breath. I believe the killer meant to poison someone else, but Hugo drank the wrong glass. She was silent for a moment. And now? Now, Price said, we find out who was supposed to die, and who would benefit most if they had. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Gallery. Morning broke over Eldridge Hall with a dense fog. Inspector Harold Price was wide awake, and already dressed by 7 o'clock. He had requested that breakfast be served in the long gallery, a vaulted corridor lined with ancestral portraits, antique suits of armour, and glass cases holding curiosities gathered during the Marwood family's long imperial legacy, Zulu spears, Egyptian amulets, and a fan said to have belonged to Marie Antoinette. The setting was no accident. The gallery offered excellent acoustics, long sightlines, and an ambience that encouraged discomfort, 3 tools Price intended to use today. The footman who served tea, young and fresh-faced, tried not to look too nervous, as Price gently questioned him. Did you notice anything unusual yesterday evening, around 10? The lad hesitated. Only that one of the trays, silver with red-rimmed glasses, was sent back to the scullery untouched. Why? The lady said it was not her drink. Which lady? I don't recall exactly, sir. One of the ones with feathers. That narrowed it down to half the guests. And who served drinks in the music room? The footman flushed. None of us, sir. That room was closed after the piano tuner left. Drinks were only supposed to be served in the ballroom, drawing rooms, and terrace. Price's brow furrowed. Then how did a poisoned glass end up behind the curtain? The boy blinked. I don't know, sir, but one of the guests, Mr. Radley, wandered into the music room earlier. Said he needed quiet. Might have taken a glass with him. Later that morning, Price joined Lady Agatha in the conservatory, where she sat among orchids and palms, her eyes red-rimmed but her posture unbent. She was dressed in a deep violet morning gown, her silver hair neatly pinned. The scent of bergamot hung faintly in the warm air. I need you to tell me about Sir Cedric, Price said without preamble. Lady Agatha did not flinch. My husband was a complicated man, she said. Respected by the Foreign Office, feared by many. His posting in South Africa changed him. There were rumours, yes, that he stole something, that he made deals with mining barons behind the Crown's back. Something to do with diamonds? She sipped her tea. There was a shipment, Kimberley, 1902. A consignment of raw stones meant for a government reserve disappeared en route. Nothing was ever proven, but Cedric returned a very wealthy man. And Danforth knew about this? Yes, he served in the Colonial Guard then. He and Cedric were close until they weren't. And recently, Price pressed, was he blackmailing you? No, not me, Lady Agatha's voice dropped. Eliza, he wanted her restored as heir. Price's pen paused. Why? Because he believed she was Cedric's illegitimate daughter. Later that afternoon, Price returned to the long gallery, this time alone. He studied the portraits, all solemn Marwoods in powdered wigs or crimson coats, and paused before a large oil painting of Sir Cedric Marwood, painted shortly before his death. The eyes, dark and inscrutable, seemed to follow Price as he moved. Something was off. The frame was dusted, but the edges of the canvas had a faint smear of oil, as though it had been recently handled. Gently, Price lifted the right side of the frame from the wall. It swung open on hidden hinges. A recess lay behind it. Inside, rolled tightly and secured with twine, was a page torn from a letter, old, browned, and typed in that same antique style as the note Lady Agatha had received. Price unrolled it carefully. And if you believe I'll stay silent while the Marwoods rob another soul blind, you're wrong. The papers still exist. If anything happens to me, they will surface. The truth always does. HDHD for Hugo Danforth. So the Colonel had not only threatened Lady Agatha, but had made arrangements in the event of his death. The stakes were higher than Price had guessed. This was no simple case of jealousy or vengeance. There were secrets someone was willing to kill for. By twilight, the atmosphere in the house grew taut again. Vivian Street Clare requested to be excused from dinner, claiming a migraine. Eliza remained locked in her room, and Peter Radley had taken to pacing the grounds like a restless dog. Lady Agatha, meanwhile, had ordered her staff to keep all glasses under watch. Price decided to keep watch during the evening. He lingered in shadowed corridors, observing who came and went from the drawing rooms, who lingered too long by the serving carts, and just past 10 o'clock, as the house retired for the night, he heard the sound of glass shattering near the conservatory. He rushed toward the sound. In the tiled hallway leading to the solarium, he found Vivian slumped on the floor, gasping, clutching at her throat. A crystal glass lay shattered nearby, the remains of what looked like port puddled around it. Price called for help. Dr. Bexley arrived within minutes. "She's been poisoned," he said grimly, "but not fatally, not this time." Vivian came to an hour later, propped up on pillows in a guest room, her colour returning. Price sat beside her. "Was it your own drink?" Vivian shook her head weakly. "No, I took it from the tray. It looked untouched." "Someone meant for you to drink that," he said quietly. Her lips parted in horror. "Then, Hugo, last night, he must have picked up my glass." Price nodded grimly. "The poison wasn't meant for Hugo Danforth," he said. "It was meant for you." By the close of the day, Price had gathered his threads into a clearer tapestry. Hugo Danforth had discovered secrets about Sir Cedric Marwood, and perhaps about Eliza's paternity. Vivian had been targeted with poison, twice. Peter Radley had a grudge connected to the war. Lady Agatha had lied by omission and concealed a letter behind a painting. Someone in this house had tried once more to kill and failed. But Price was not fooled. The murderer, he now believed, had acted out of fear, not hatred, fear of exposure, fear of secrets made public, and fear, Price knew, made people reckless. Chapter 5. A second silence. The following morning broke grey and sullen, the skies above Eldridge Hall heavy with unshed rain. Inspector Harold Price stood at the east wing's window, sipping weak tea and scanning the grounds below. Vivian Street Clare had survived her brush with death the night before, but only narrowly. Someone had tried to poison her, again, and failed, but not for lack of intent, and that meant the killer was growing desperate. Vivian had remained unconscious most of the night, under the care of Dr. Julian Bexley. Lady Agatha had ordered a maid to sit outside her door, claiming it was for protection, though Price suspected it was just as much about containment. Word of the second poisoning was spreading, despite efforts to keep it quiet. In the dining room, breakfast was a sombre affair. The long oak table, polished to a gleam, hosted only 6 of the guests. Vivian and Eliza were absent. Lady Agatha presided at the head of the table, pale and stiff, while Peter Radley stirred his porridge absently, and Colonel Barrington crunched his bacon with military precision. Price sipped black coffee and said nothing at first. He let the weight of the silence do his work. Then softly he said, "It appears the poisoner is still among us." Chairs shifted, utensils clinked against china. "You're certain it was poison?" Barrington asked. Price nodded. Identical symptoms to Colonel Danforth's death: tightening of the chest, visual distortion, numbness in the hands. Dr. Bexley confirmed. But this time, the dose was smaller, or poorly prepared. Perhaps it was meant to incapacitate, not kill. Peter Radley gave a short, humourless laugh. Or perhaps someone is losing their nerve. Lady Agatha's eyes narrowed. "If I find that any guest in my home is responsible for this madness," Price cut in gently. "Lady Agatha, if the killer is who I suspect, they have far more at stake than wounded pride." He stood and placed both hands on the table. I intend to search every guest room, discreetly, but thoroughly, and I will begin with yours, Mr. Radley." Peter paled but said nothing. With the quiet assistance of the house steward and a discreet footman, Price began combing through the guest rooms. He started with Peter Radley's quarters, a Spartan suite of a young man trying to appear above luxury. Books lined the writing desk, poems scrawled in a leather notebook, but it was what lay tucked inside a folded page that made Price pause. A torn envelope, postmarked from Pretoria, South Africa. Inside was a note: "Danforth cannot be trusted. If he speaks, it's all lost. Remove the threat." J.B. Price folded it silently and pocketed it. J.B. Julian Bexley. He moved next to Eliza's suite. She was there, pale and sitting near the window. Her face was drawn. "You're searching my things." "I am," Price said gently. "For your own safety, as much as anything else." She nodded. "Do you think I poisoned Vivian?" "No," Price said, "but I think someone meant to make it appear as if you did." In a sewing box near her wardrobe, he found something peculiar, a second mask, one not part of her original costume. A simple white satin domino mask, smeared faintly on the inside with what looked like red powder. "Lip rouge? Eliza, is this yours?" "No," she said slowly. "I've never seen it. And yet it was found with your things." She looked at him. "Inspector, I think someone planted it." Late that afternoon, as the sky darkened with approaching rain, one of the maids, breathless and frightened, came running into the hall. "In the greenhouse, sir," she cried. "Miss Eliza, she's hurt." Price raced across the lawn, through the chilled wind, and into the greenhouse. The scent of soil and orchids was overpowering. Eliza lay on a wicker chaise, motionless, a small brown bottle at her side, and a folded note in her lap. Dr. Bexley arrived moments later, followed by Lady Agatha and Peter Radley. Price picked up the note. "To whom it may concern, I am tired. I cannot bear the whispers or the looks. I never meant for any of this to happen. If Hugo is dead because of me, I am sorry. Let this be my confession. Eliza." Lady Agatha gasped and rushed to her niece, but Price raised a hand. "She's alive. The pulse is faint, but present." Dr. Bexley confirmed it moments later. "A sedative," he said. "Something strong, but not lethal in this dose." Price frowned. "Conveniently not lethal, as if it were meant to appear fatal." He unfolded the note again, then held it next to another sample of Eliza's writing. The difference was stark. The so-called confession was shaky, hesitant, and oddly slanted, as if written by someone imitating her hand. And the ink? Price plucked a pen from her desk upstairs and compared it. The ink was blue-black. The note had been written in a reddish-brown ink, like the one found in the study downstairs. Eliza had been framed. Again. That evening, Price gathered the remaining guests in the library. The fire cracked behind him, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rugs and the dark spines of ancient books. Vivian, still pale but recovered enough to sit, looked around nervously. Peter Radley was tense, lips pressed into a line. Barrington scowled from his chair, arms folded. Lady Agatha sat upright, unblinking. Price addressed them all. "Someone in this room attempted to kill Vivian St. Clair, not once, but twice. And when that failed, they attempted to frame Miss Eliza Marwood with a forged confession and an attempted overdose. The intention, I believe, was not just to eliminate Vivian, but to control the narrative." He turned to Dr. Julian Bexley, who had just entered with a tray of brandy. "Tell me, Doctor, how well do you know the effects of digitalis?" Bexley blinked. "Well enough. I've used it to treat heart patients." "And how difficult is it to dose correctly?" Bexley hesitated. "It requires precision." Price nodded. "Yes, which is why someone with medical knowledge would be the only one who could attempt 2 poisonings and get it almost, but not quite right." The doctor paled. "You wrote a letter to Peter Radley," Price said, withdrawing the page, "warning him that Danforth was a threat. You signed it J.B. You assumed it had been destroyed. Bexley's eyes darted across the room. That proves nothing. It proves you knew Danforth had knowledge that could ruin your position. Perhaps about Sir Cedric's dealings in South Africa. Perhaps more. He turned to Peter. And you, Mr. Radley, you admitted your brother served under Danforth. You hated him. You believed he sent your brother to his death. I never touched Hugo, Peter hissed. No, Price agreed, but someone else might have. Someone with access. Someone like Dr. Bexley. The room fell silent, but Price raised a hand. Not yet. I don't have the final proof, but I will. Because whoever committed this crime is unravelling. And in that unravelling, they will make a mistake. He paused, then added with quiet finality, one more. Chapter 6. What the Servants Saw. It was nearly midnight, and Inspector Price stood once again in the long gallery. The lamps were low, casting elongated shadows across the parquet floor. Behind Price, the heavy doors creaked open. It was Mrs. Langley, the housekeeper. You asked to see me, sir? Yes, Mrs. Langley. Price turned and gestured to the oak bench beneath the portrait of Lady Beatrice Marwood. Please, sit down. The housekeeper was a tall, angular woman in her 50s with neatly pinned hair and eyes that missed nothing. She sat with the practiced grace of someone used to being invisible. Price didn't begin with accusations. He began with respect. You've run Eldridge Hall for nearly 20 years, haven't you? Since before Sir Cedric's death, she confirmed, her voice low and precise. Then you know this house and its people better than anyone. Tell me what you saw the night Colonel Danforth died. Anything that seemed out of place. Mrs. Langley hesitated. There's much that seems out of place lately, Inspector. Then let's begin there. She began with the guests. Miss St. Clair, for instance. She's a fine actress, no doubt, but not as delicate as she appears. She was overheard arguing with Colonel Danforth 2 nights before the masquerade. In the morning room, she threatened to expose him. For what? I don't know, but she mentioned Paris and the word betrayal. And the Colonel? He laughed at her, said she didn't have the stomach. Price nodded and scribbled a note. And what about Dr. Bexley? He's always been polite, but I've seen him in Lady Agatha's study more than once, uninvited, going through drawers. Price looked up. Recently? 2 nights before the ball, I asked if he needed something and he claimed he was looking for correspondence, but it was the locked drawer he lingered over. The locked drawer that once held Cedric Marwood's personal papers. And Peter Radley? He keeps odd hours, walks the halls at night, talks to himself in the rose garden. The footman said he once saw him come in from the stables, muddy up to the knees, the morning after Hugo's death. Why would he be in the stables? Mrs. Langley's voice lowered. I believe he was searching for something, or hiding something. Inspector Price rose and crossed to the wall, where a suit of armour gleamed faintly in the dim light. His mind turned again to the second mask found in Eliza's room. The white satin domino smeared with red rouge. A planted clue, a deliberate misdirection. He retrieved it from the evidence satchel and laid it on the table before Mrs. Langley. Do you recognise this? The housekeeper frowned. That's from the guest collection. From the costume vault on the 3rd floor. We keep spares in case guests lose or damage theirs. Who accessed that collection recently? I only saw one person come from that stairwell after the ball, she said slowly. It was Dr. Bexley, but he claimed to be looking for a bottle of spirits left behind by Colonel Barrington. Price descended the servant stairs and made his way to the back hall, where a lantern burned low. A young scullery maid, Elsa, sat peeling potatoes in silence. She looked up, startled. Inspector? Price crouched beside her. I believe you saw something you haven't told me. Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't know what to do, sir. Start from the beginning. She wiped her hands. On the night of the ball, I was bringing linens to the upstairs wing. I took the servants' staircase so as not to be seen. Just as I came to the landing, I saw someone slip into the music room. Who? She swallowed. Dr. Bexley. He was holding a glass and looking over his shoulder, like he didn't want to be seen. Then he placed the glass on the piano, behind the curtain and left. "And when did you see this?" "Moments before the lights flickered." Price made his way to the conservatory, where Dr. Bexley had retreated after dinner, claiming the fresh air helped his nerves. He was standing near a cluster of orchids, smoking slowly. "Evening, Inspector." "Let's speak plainly, Doctor." Bexley turned, the smile flickering at the corners of his mouth. "Plainly? You were seen placing a poisoned glass in the music room the night Colonel Danforth died." Bexley did not flinch. "By whom?" "By someone with no reason to lie." "And your evidence?" "Circumstantial, for now. But mounting, you also accessed the costume vault the next day. You planted a second mask in Eliza's room." Now the doctor's expression soured. "You're clever, Price, but you lack proof." Price stepped closer. "I have proof that you forged Eliza's suicide note. The ink came from Lady Agatha's desk, the same desk you were seen tampering with." Bexley flicked ash into a potted fern. "Do you know what it's like, Inspector, to live your whole life cleaning up the messes of greater men? Cedric, Hugo, even Agatha, manipulators all. I kept their secrets, I silenced their scandals. And for what? So you admit it?" "I admit only that I'm tired of being the one who watches and waits, while the powerful survive unscathed." "And Vivian?" "She betrayed me," Bexley said darkly. "She and Hugo both. They were going to expose the whole sordid truth about Cedric, about the missing diamonds, about the fund I managed on behalf of the Marwoods." Price's voice dropped to a whisper. "And you poisoned her because she was a threat." "I tried to stop her. The first dose was meant only to sicken her, warn her. But Hugo, he drank it instead. A mistake." "And Eliza?" "Collateral. She was too curious, too close to uncovering the inheritance fraud. Cedric changed his will to benefit her. I couldn't let that stand." "And now?" "Now, Inspector," Bexley said softly, "you'll have to prove it." As Price left the conservatory, he felt the final thread tug taut. He now knew the killer's identity, but he didn't yet know everything. The forgeries, the diamonds, the letter from Pretoria, the inheritance, and most of all, the question that haunted him. Who else was involved? Because Dr. Bexley hadn't acted alone. He had an accomplice, and tomorrow Price would expose them both. Chapter 7. The clock strikes twice. Rain lashed the ivy-covered walls of Eldridge Hall as the guests assembled once more in the drawing room, summoned by Inspector Harold Price for what many assumed would be the end of their ordeal. The fire crackled, but its warmth did little to thaw the chill in the room. Vivian Street Clare, wrapped in a shawl, sat nearest the flames, still pale but more composed than the night before. Colonel Barrington leaned stiffly against the mantel, arms crossed. Peter Radley occupied a narrow wing-back chair by the bookcase, chain-smoking in silence. Lady Agatha sat upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Eliza Marwood, now recovered from the sedative, stood at the far end of the room. Only Dr. Julian Bexley was absent. At Price's request, he had been confined to his room under watch. The rain struck the windows with steady rhythm. Inspector Price stood, slowly scanning each face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you have all been patient. But I ask for it a moment longer, because I believe we are now at the end." He paused by the fireplace and reached into his coat, withdrawing 3 items: the torn letter found behind Sir Cedric's portrait, the forged suicide note, and the white satin mask from Eliza's room. "These are the keys," he said, 3 pieces that, when placed correctly, reveal a puzzle far more intricate than simple murder. He held up the torn letter. Hugo Danforth did not come to Eldridge Hall by whim. He came with purpose. He had discovered the truth about a fortune, diamonds stolen in South Africa, and funneled through discreet hands to fund Sir Cedric's rise. That truth, if exposed, would have destroyed the Marwood legacy and cost a certain doctor his stake in its financial future. He now held up the mask. The second mask, found among Eliza's possessions, was not hers. It came from the costume vault, a calculated plant meant to frame her And it nearly worked, as did the forged confession, crafted in another's hand and written in ink, only found in Lady Agatha's private study. He turned slowly to face them all. Dr. Julian Bexley poisoned Vivian St. Clair, not once but twice. The first time, it was intended to sicken her, but Hugo Danforth picked up her glass by mistake and died. The second time, the poison was weaker, meant to frighten her into silence. Gasps echoed around the room. Lady Agatha pressed a hand to her lips. Price continued. But there is more. Bexley did not act alone. He was clever, yes, but not bold. He had an accomplice, someone who helped him place the glass, forge the note, and hide the letter. Someone who moved freely in the house, who stood to gain if the Marwood fortune stayed buried. His voice dropped. Someone who pretended to be above it all. He turned. Mr. Peter Radley. All heads turned sharply. Peter blinked, stunned. Then he laughed. A short, brittle sound. That's absurd. Is it? Price asked calmly. You loathed Danforth. You believed he led your brother to his death. And you wanted justice, but not in court, in print. You wanted the story. And when you learned Vivian and Hugo planned to expose the diamond scandal through a journalist in London, you saw your chance. Peter's face tightened. I was never involved. You were, Price said. You knew Danforth's habits. You even encouraged him to take a drink that night. Vivian's glass. You lured him to the music room. You delayed him just long enough for the poison to take hold. Peter's voice was sharp now. You can't prove that. Price walked over to the table and picked up a silver watch. Peter's, recovered from the stable earlier that day. This watch was dropped the night of the masquerade. It was found behind the curtain, where Danforth died. Peter's facade crumbled. You don't understand, he said, standing abruptly. Danforth deserved it. He was a war criminal, and Vivian, she was going to sell the story to the press. She didn't care who got hurt. Then why not let her die? Price asked softly. Peter hesitated. Because, said a voice behind them, weak but steady, he still loved me. All turned her Vivian Street. Claire had risen. Her eyes shone with fury and heartbreak. You spineless coward, she said. You killed a man. You tried to kill me. And you let that girl, Eliza, take the blame. Peter's face crumpled. I didn't know Bexley would go that far, he said, voice shaking. I thought he'd scare you into leaving. That's all. You thought wrong, Vivian snapped. At that moment, from the hallway beyond the drawing room, the tall grandfather clock struck the hour. Once, twice. Price turned his head slowly. The clock, he said. It struck twice last night, once at 10 and again at 10:30. That second chime wasn't from the clock. It was from a timed bell mechanism, one that Bexley used to signal when the poison would take effect. Lady Agatha gasped. You mean it was a signal, Price said, so the accomplice would know the deed was done. He stepped forward. And that, gentlemen and ladies, is how you commit a murder in plain sight, with masks, lies, and just enough confusion to make the innocent appear guilty. 2 constables arrived that night, summoned earlier by telegram. Dr. Julian Bexley was taken from his room without resistance. Peter Radley, pale and shaking, was placed under house arrest, pending further charges. Lady Agatha stood at the drawing-room window, staring out into the rain as the motorcar's lanterns disappeared down the drive. Vivian sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. Price poured himself a brandy and sat heavily in a chair near the fire. Well, he said softly, a masquerade indeed. Chapter 8. The Final Masquerade. A week had passed since the arrests at Eldridge Hall, yet the estate still wore the memory of the masquerade like a wound. The staff moved with practised solemnity, and the guests, those who remained, had retreated into private grief, disbelief, or relief, depending on their role in the unravelling of that fateful night. Inspector Harold Price, however, was not finished. Though Dr. Julian Bexley and Peter Radley had confessed to their respective parts in the murder of Colonel Hugo Danforth, there remained threads that pulled at the edges of the story. Discrepancies in the timeline, inconsistencies in motive, and more importantly, a gnawing feeling that something vital had been staged. Because as experienced as Price was, something didn't sit right. On the morning of his departure, Price once again stood before the large oil painting of Sir Cedric Marwood in the Long Gallery. A butler had informed him that the remaining Marwood papers, previously locked away, had finally been turned over to the solicitor, and that Lady Agatha wished to see him before he left. He waited, listening to the echo of his own footsteps on the gallery floor. Something had eluded him, something simple. Then he saw it. In the oil painting's lower right corner, partially obscured by the signature of the artist, was a tiny, near-invisible smudge. A wax seal painted deliberately into the folds of Cedric's coat. A seal he had seen before. He turned sharply and strode to Lady Agatha's study. Lady Agatha sat at her desk, dressed in a steel-grey morning gown, her hands folded atop a closed leather ledger. "You've come to say goodbye?" she asked without looking up. "I came," said Price, "to ask you a final question." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I believe you were the one who invited Danforth," he said. "Not to stop him, but to trap him." Her lips parted slightly. "Go on." "You knew what he carried. You knew he possessed papers that would destroy the Marwood name, evidence of Sir Cedric's theft of the Kimberley diamonds, perhaps even of secret wartime dealings. But you also knew Danforth was too arrogant to release them publicly without some form of spectacle. You used the masquerade to bait him into a vulnerable position." Lady Agatha's voice was quiet. "You think I wanted him dead?" "I think," Price said, "you knew someone else would want him dead, and you let them do your work." Her silence spoke volumes. Price stepped closer. "You allowed Bexley to believe he was acting independently. But it was you who showed him the ledger. You who left the study unlocked. You who allowed the rumour of Eliza's inheritance to spread." Lady Agatha finally looked up. Danforth was a parasite, a man who fed on the guilt of others, and who had already destroyed more than one life with his manipulations. He was not content with justice. He wanted vengeance and payment. "And so you orchestrated the masquerade to look like a tragedy," Price said softly, "when it was in fact an execution." She didn't deny it. Instead, she stood and walked to the window. "My husband built a legacy on theft and diplomacy. I spent 30 years holding it together. My mistake, Inspector, was assuming I could retire from the game." "And Eliza?" Price asked. "She will inherit what Cedric owed her," Lady Agatha said, "and I will make certain she never knows how close she came to ruin." "You let her take the fall." "I protected her the only way I could, by letting others fall first." Price left the study without another word. In his coat pocket, he carried the final piece of evidence, a sealed envelope he had retrieved from the secret panel behind Cedric's portrait. It contained a full list of false names, accounts, and bearer bonds tied to the missing Kimberley diamonds. It could ruin the Marwood name forever, or it could be quietly filed away, and a young woman named Eliza Marwood could begin again, unaware of her true parentage, of the games played to preserve her future. Price reached the edge of the estate where his motor car waited. He held the envelope over the brazier beside the gate, flames licking gently at the ash-filled grate. He paused, then dropped the envelope into the fire. Some truths, he reasoned, were less useful than silence. Epilogue. A letter and a mask. 2 weeks later, at Scotland Yard, Price received a small parcel in the post. It was a box wrapped in fine black ribbon. Inside was a white satin domino mask, freshly pressed, and a short note in Lady Agatha's unmistakable hand: "To the only man at the ball who didn't pretend to be someone else. With gratitude, A." Price folded the note, placed it in his desk, and leaned back in his chair. He poured himself a measure of whiskey, swirled it once, and murmured, "Masquerade's over." But even as he said it, he knew there would always be another.